The speaker is pleased to introduce students from the Institute for Community Leadership who are with us today. These young students and their peers spent the week of their winter-summer break in a residential program studying the life of Dr. King and are here this morning to share some of their reflections. The Institute of Community Leadership conducts classes and out-of-school programming featuring civic engagement and social responsibility as a means to fortify academic excellence and schools and community problem solving. They're in Olympia today to commemorate the contributions of Dr. King and to share their insight on Dr. King's work and constructive, inclusive civil society.
Good morning. Thank you for the work you do for our state schools, families, and students. Today, in this world, we live in a society where so many of us are stuck in neutral. We see this in the lack of civic engagement today. Dr. King teaches us that one of the greatest tragedies in times of change is too many of us fail to remain awake. It is up to all of us to overcome this obstacle. We need to blink back our drowsiness, open our eyes. We need to get out of our comfort zones. We need to move out of the parking lot and onto the highway of taking risks and daring to dream. Indeed, dreaming requires taking risks. We have all felt the devastation of a fallen dream. Dr. King teaches us there are 3 negative responses to a fallen dream. 1, resorting to a bitter, vengeful persona. 2, adopting an introverted self. Or 3, developing a fatalistic, blaming attitude. Dr. King challenges us, instead of falling into these negative responses, we instead take our shattered dreams and turn them into assets. For it is not what happens to us that determines who we are, but what we do with what happens to us that matters. Let us celebrate Dr. King's life and legacy by first taking the highway and second by taking the high road. Thank you.
Dr. King teaches us how to develop consciousness. The definition of consciousness is to be awake. Developing our ability to stay awake and raise our consciousness will create a stronger democracy and a peaceful tomorrow. Dr. King points out steps that we can take to develop our consciousness. The first step is changing our conduct. When we change our conduct, our character either grows or shrinks. We all probably know teenagers who open doors for others. And we all probably know teenagers who habitually do not. Simple actions like this either raises one's character or lowers it. As we become proficient at conducting ourselves in ways that serve others, our character continues to rise. If we have low character, we have little consciousness. And we all know that when we wrap ourselves up in ourselves, we make a very little package. Doing things for others raises character, and if our character is higher, we can see people from much further away, perhaps even on the other side of the world. And we see much broader. We see people from across town and across the lines of difference that keep us separated. With persistent conduct changes that raises our characters, we can remain alert. We connect with people from different races, colors, cultures, and nationalities in ways that serve the greater good. Changes we can make, like eating with folks who are different from us in our lunchrooms and our cafeterias, opening doors, smiling. Simple conduct changes like these assure that our ends are in our means. Dr. King would urge us today to be the change we wish to see in the world. Thank you.
Dr. Martin Luther King challenges us to consider living a life rooted in the principles of nonviolence. Nonviolent power is a beautiful gift given to all. However, we can fail to recognize it. We can choose not to accept it. It is a matter of our power and our responsibility to make decisions. We can choose to unify, to bring together, or we can choose to separate, to divide. Building our beloved communities requires intentional, sustained acts of nonviolence. Dr. King teaches us that nonviolence is neither weak nor anemic. It requires a harmonious blending of a tough mind and a tender heart. Nonviolence seeks not to defeat nor to humiliate. Rather, it involves a willingness to accept suffering without retaliation. It is rooted in the profound and hopeful conviction that the world is sided on justice. Today we have the opportunity to practice nonviolent power, acknowledging it takes compassion, humility, discipline, and great listening skills. Dr. King's legacy calls upon us to build up and not tear down, to lift up and not push out. He teaches us that nonviolence is a peaceful and just weapon which cuts without wounding and ennobles the people who wield it. It is a sword that heals. This is a pivotal moment in history to heal our communities and create a more perfect union. Thank you.
Could we just give them one more hand, please? Thank you very much. The speakers, please recognize Dr. Nylan Rosen and Dr. Karen Bolke, and students from the Institute for Community Leadership. Will they please stand and be recognized? They're in the North Gallery. Thank you. House Resolution 4647, honoring Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the clerk will read.
Whereas today, January 20th, 2020, we join the nation in honor and celebration of the profound legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And whereas we remember Dr. King's courage, commitment, and unwavering compassion in the face of tremendous injustice. And whereas Dr. King once said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And whereas he propelled a movement to end unfair laws and fulfill the promise of democracy for every person, bringing the truth of segregation and civil rights into households across America. And whereas Dr. King did not let a C in his public speaking class deter him from igniting passion in a nonviolent philosophy to an entire nation. And whereas we continue to draw inspiration from his teachings.
Last line.
People.
The gentleman from the 30th District, Representative Johnson.
I move adoption of the House resolution.
It has been moved and seconded that House Resolution 4647 be adopted. Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your visionary leadership in this chamber. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be in my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horrors of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. That was the poem Invictus by William Ernest Henley. Nelson Mandela read that to fellow prisoners during confinement. And I believe that poem is the embodiment of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a man of character and a man of empathy. His moral compass always pointed towards justice. And that's why he could lead a movement that revolutionized the entire world. Because Dr. King used both his voice and his vision to get to people at their core. He made people believe that change was, in fact, possible. He got people to ask themselves a fundamental, life-altering question. Why? It's one word, 3 letters. Why? What is your why? What is your purpose? What is our why? What is our purpose? Your why, which brings about introspection, looking deep within yourself, innovation, and ingenuity. Dr. King answered that question not just with deeds and words, but with action, collaborative action. When they threw him in a Birmingham jail, he wrote letters that inspired America. And when he gave his life to the cause of civil rights, social justice, for all of us, his ideas and legacy lived on. Dr. King awakened us to a moral consciousness, a sense of other, of what it truly means to be free in this world. That freedom is not just a state, but an act. That silence in the face of injustice and oppression is worse than injustice and oppression itself. That regardless of your skin color or gender, every one of us deserves the basic rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because as a society, we have become far too well adjusted to injustice. We must first recognize our reality before working to change it. And the reality of today has an ugly side. Black men, women, and children are still being gunned down in the streets at higher numbers than any time in our history. 100 years after recognizing women's right to vote, women's rights are still being attacked. Our family, friends, and neighbors are living in fear every day of deportation. Refugee children are being locked in cages, and far too many LGBTQ teenagers are living on the streets, being kicked out of their homes, homeless. Kids are still going to school hungry, and our economy is not working for everyone. I believe the expectation that a people can be immersed in suffering and injustice without being harmed is as unrealistic as walking on water without getting wet. If he were alive today, what would Dr. King say? He wouldn't be going around writing books, memoirs, and going on book tours, but he would be at the funerals of victims of gun violence on Sunday and marching on the streets on Monday. He wouldn't rest until moms and dads with full-time jobs or 2 or 3 jobs got a fair wage, and those little boys and girls were removed from those cages. Because as Dr. King once said, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but at times of challenge and controversy. We are challenged today. We are in a time of immense and profound conflict and controversy. So on this historic day, Dr. King would not want us to just shower him with praise. He would want us to act. Today, tomorrow, and the week after that. Because in this chamber, each of us are the masters of our fate and the captains of our soul. So I leave you with this. I hope we have the courage, Mr. Speaker, to continue the work of Dr. King. Even if we are planting seeds in a garden we may never see grow. Seeds of opportunity, seeds of love, seeds of tolerance, seeds of justice, seeds of hope. Because in every corner of the great state of Washington, that's what our people deserve. Thank you.
The gentleman from the 13th District, Representative Ibarra.
Today our nation commemorates Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who stood on the steps of Lincoln Memorial and spoke for the dreams of equality and justice for all. Like some of us in this room, I didn't know who Martin Luther King was. I grew up in the 60s. I saw him on TV. My family was migrant, so there was no African Americans in our community. So when Martin Luther King was on TV, I asked my dad, what's he doing? What's civil rights? And he said, well, in the South, or across the country, African Americans are treated badly. And I said, oh, okay. So I knew something. I was just a kid at the time, so I didn't really know. As time went on, one of the things that Martin Luther King said was that there's prejudice out there. And I'll tell you some prejudice that was not only happening to African Americans, but also to the Hispanic communities. In my community, I'll give you a story. Sunnyside, Washington. My brother was going to be born. My mom went into labor. They lived in a little country home outside of Sunnyside. And my dad didn't have a car, so he went to the farmhouse, ran about a mile away, went to use a phone to get a car so my mom could go to the hospital. Well, gets to the farmhouse, knocks on the door, a farmer comes out and says, my dad says, can I use your phone? And the farmer said, no. And my dad's going, my wife's in labor, I need to call for help. And he said, no. And the only reason I'm telling you no is because you're Mexican. That's prejudice. This is all before Martin Luther King. When I got to my hometown, get there, the way it was set up was just like a West Side Story. If you remember that movie back in the day, you had the railroad tracks. You had the white people on one side, and on the north side, on C Street, that's where the Hispanics or the Mexicans lived. We called it tortilla flats. That's how we grew up. When I got to high school, so as a freshman, my sophomore brother, took me in and he said, Alex, here's the rules. You go down that hall because that's a Mexican hall. You go down this hall, that's the white hall. And you don't want to go down that hall because the Mexicans will beat you up. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, they'll beat you up because you're trying to be like a white guy. And I said, well, how do I get to class? How do I move around? He goes, well, you just have to maneuver and just not hang around with white people, or else you're going to get beat up. That is prejudiced. And that's what it's like. That's the real life of it. When Martin Luther King came, all of a sudden things changed. I wasn't being called those vile names I've been called my whole life. Those names that get called all the time. All of a sudden I was called just a Mexican, not anything behind it. All those names that we all know what those names are. I was called a Mexican. They still didn't like me too much, but at least it was better. I could go down that hall. After a little while, I could go down that hall, go to my class, mingle with white people because they let us. And we kind of fought the fight. And it wasn't because of me, it was because of Martin Luther King and some of the things he did that make people change their mannerisms, their thinking about what it is to be a person, not the color of your skin, but a person. And so as time went on, living in Quincy, all of a sudden I'm a school board member. All of a sudden I get voted in twice. All of a sudden I'm a state representative, and I'm here at this floor with these wonderful folks that are here trying to change this world for the better. And that was all due to Martin Luther King and his dream to make everybody the same. I can go back home, I can mingle with white people, African Americans, with Hispanics, and we're all the same. We have a long ways to go, but he's the one that got started, and let's just keep going forward. Thank you.
The gentleman from the 23rd District, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of you have probably visited the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C. There's a giant statue of Dr. King emerging from a wall of rock, and then quotations around the statue from Dr. King's works. I think the idea is to give the viewer a capsule introduction to the essentials of what Dr. King believed. So you will read some of the stirring words that we've heard this morning. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And you'll leave hopeful and comforted by Dr. King's apparent belief that we humans can learn to love each other because we are basically kind and decent, and through hard work and listening to one another and understanding, we can together build that beloved community that Dr. King wrote about. This is very close to the exact opposite of what Dr. King actually believed. I can say this with some confidence because, as many of you know, some years ago I wrote a book about Dr. King and the I Have a Dream speech, and as part of that project read every single word of Dr. King's seminary and graduate school essays. The last time I was at the memorial, I was happy to see they had a lot of copies of my book for sale. Before I realized that was not exactly a good point, that they had lots of copies of my book for sale, because that meant no one was buying my book. Dr. King, so this belief, right, that humans are perfectible and hopeful and basically good, this was part of theological liberalism, which was the dominant school of thought at Crozier Theological Seminary, where King got his master's in divinity, and Boston University, where he got his PhD. King definitely did not believe that, and he made sure his professors knew it, not because of some theological critique based in the words of Martin Luther, from whom he got his name, but from a much simpler and more powerful reason. King grew up as a black man in the segregated South. So as he wrote in a seminary essay, quote, "Certain experiences that I had in the South with a vicious race problem made it very difficult for me to believe in the essential goodness of man," close quote. Instead, he told his professors, quote, "Liberal theology has too easily cast aside the term sin, failing to recognize that many of our evils are due to just plain sin," close quote. So white supremacy then for King is not just a political ideology, it is a very, very deep sin. One of his theology professors wrote an entire book called Racism and the Christian Understanding of Man, which is a book-length exposition of white supremacy as idolatry, as a worship of the false god of race rather than the risen Lord. And King thought that this sin was very, very deep in America and deep in the human heart. As he said late in his life, quote, "The vast majority of whites are racist, either consciously or unconsciously," close quote. Now, this doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do. Obviously, Dr. King's entire career was devoted towards pushing forward state action to limit the damage that racism can do to God's children. As King famously said, "The law cannot make a man love me, but it can stop him from lynching me." But our hope in the efficacy of that action doesn't rest in some belief about the power of American democracy or of the inherent goodness of the human heart. It rests instead on King's belief of the transforming power of God, which, by the way, that word God, that is not a word that you will see on the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is astonishing. A memorial honoring the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, whose doctorate was in theology and who founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, somehow exists without mentioning the faith that gave Dr. King his own hope. I'll tell one quick story and I'll close here. Early in the Montgomery bus boycott, Dr. King received death threats, which he did on a regular basis. But one night they got to him in an unusual way, and he had an experience that he would speak about for the rest of his life. He went into the kitchen and he brewed himself a cup of coffee, and he sat there in prayer thinking about what he'd learned in seminary and graduate school. And he said, "Mr. Speaker, can I read Dr. King's own..."
Please continue.
Thank you. Dr. King said, "And I prayed a prayer, and I prayed out loud that night. I said, Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause that we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. And I can't let the people see me like this, because if they see me weak and losing my courage, they will begin to get weak." And it seemed at that moment I could hear an inner voice saying to me, "Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice, stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you, even until the end of the world." And that's what Dr. King believed, that racism is a deep, deep sin, very deep in this nation and in the human heart. Number two, that we still have a duty to work towards action that will limit the damage racism can do to God's children. But third, that our hope lies ultimately not in American democracy or in human hearts, but in the risen Lord. This is not necessarily a familiar or comforting version of Dr. King's message, but it is what he believed. And on this day, we may as well do him the honor of remembering him accurately. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from the 26th District, Representative Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise and address the body today. I don't find now with my time in the legislature that I get nervous when I speak to the body. I'm nervous now. I don't share a lot of my personal story, but it's nerve-wracking to stand on a day like this and attempt to address a body when you're really standing in the shadow of such a great man. The words that you say should be poignant, and they should be reverent, and I hope I do them justice. Martin Luther King Jr. was a man of prayer. If you would oblige me, I'd just like to say a quick prayer. Father, I want to thank you for such a man as Martin Luther King Jr. I want to thank you for giving our national leaders the wisdom and the courage to enshrine him in 1983 as a man worthy of a national day and a national holiday. I want to thank you for the role that played in my upbringing as a young kid going through elementary school, being allowed to be introduced to such a man, a character, and an example. Father, it is so easy for us to overlook, maybe shortchange the lessons that we can learn from a man like him, because it's easy It's easy and virtually pain-free to read the quotes or hear the quotes that he said, because we didn't have to necessarily go through and pay the price that he did to produce those quotes, to come up with the experiences that led him to develop the character that would then bless our nation with such an example. And I would just pray right now that you'd bless each one of us with a special wisdom, imbue us with a character that would seek to do more than just shortchange him by reading his quotes, but not taking the time to internalize them, because it's far too easy to overlook the lessons then if we do. In Jesus' name I pray. I think one of the lessons I've learned is, as a man, it is not easy to judge one by the content of their character. It's not easy. That line means so much to me, being introduced to it, watching it as a young man, growing up in this world. But I've seen far too many people say, and hallelujah to that type of phrase, but then immediately forget about it 5 minutes later and attempt to shortchange what that phrase really means, to judge one by the content of their character. I have a couple of examples. They're personal. I hope you'll indulge me as I try to get through them. In the early 80s, in Tacoma, there's a park. It's been on the news recently. It's People's Park in Tacoma. There's a rather big homeless camp there. They're cleaning it up. And that park sits along Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue. If you grew up there and you know it used to be called K Street, I remember when they dedicated it to Martin Luther King Jr. There was a certain time, as my mom was walking out her sobriety, she went to an AA meeting and took my brother and I. We didn't have a place for us to be watched, so we came with her, and we don't go into the meetings, so we went over to People's Park, and we had a basketball, and we were just shooting hoops by ourselves, and a group of kids came up, about 10, a dozen of them maybe. My brother and I are white, and they were all black. And they came, and now this is on Hilltop, if you don't know the history of Tacoma. And they didn't really ask to play, more demanded to play, and we obliged, smart enough, street smarts, to know what we were doing. And the long story short was, after maybe a round or two of the game, they beat the crap out of my brother and me, bad. And I had to walk through that and hopefully learn a lesson that wouldn't be imbued with hate. I have another story. It's on the corner of 12th and Union in Tacoma. On the southeast corner of 12th and Union in Tacoma, there used to exist an AM/PM. It's not there any longer. For me, it's kind of a happy happenstance that it's no longer there, because on that night during high school, I was out with a couple of friends, and we stopped there for gas. And another group of kids, there was about 8 or 9 of them, stopped into the gas station while we were pumping gas and started a fight with us. We were white, they were black. And they picked a fight with one of our friends. They picked the wrong one. His name was Ryan Holt. He knew how to take care of himself. And we kind of, few of my friends, kind of wimps, jumped into the store, didn't want to get around the fighting. And Ryan Holt and this other kid, I don't know his name, got into a squabble, and they started fighting. And he picked the wrong guy. Ryan Holt got the better of him a little bit. And in the middle of that scrum, a gun was produced, and they cold-cocked Ryan Holt in the back of the head. He started bleeding pretty bad. And within short order, that gun was introduced into the front of my face. I could still see down the barrel of that gun right now. And while I sat there with that gun pointed at me, I had to endure one of those young men who I could only, with the amount of energy that he had, could only believe he was high on drugs. And he came and 5 times in a row took a running start and punched me right in the face, and I could do nothing about it. The best I could do was attempt to deflect it and make it seem like it was worse than it was. How am I supposed to judge the content of their character? It's not easy. Now, I've shared those stories in that way. I'd like to go back to the first story. I cannot hate. I can't. Because the truth is, in the first example where we were getting beat up, the kids, about a dozen of them divided, 6 of them, there were some bigger kids, there were some kids our age. It was a beat down. Half of them went after my brother, half of them went after me. And I got to say, my brother took the worst of it. And the reason why was because there was one particular kid there that protected me. While we were playing basketball, he whispered in my ear, one of the older kids that was kind of the ringleader of them, he said, don't go around him. And I stayed away from him. But when they came to start beat us up, he took the lead on doing it. And every time he would jump in to hit me, he would land a very soft blow. And he would make it seem bigger than it was. He would put on a facade for his friends. And while he would throw the punch, it would land softly. I didn't really get hurt. I felt bad for my brother that day because he took a much bigger beating. But that young man protected me. Didn't matter that he was with a group. I doubt he started that day walking down the street with his friends, expecting that they were going to get into some type of scrum like that. But the content of that man's character could be easily judged one way, but in the sense that he stood up to protect me, I can only have love for him. I can't judge a group on its whole. You need to judge someone by the content of their individual character. We also got our ball back. He ended up grabbing the ball, and I remember they were going to take the ball, but he ended up making a big show of it and said, "You want this ball?" And he booted it, but the fact that he booted it gave us a chance to go get it and go home. Now, on the night where that gun was stuck in my face, while the scrum was happening, after my friend was cold cocked in the back of the head, we tried to break it up, and there was another gentleman in that group that attempted to break it up with me from the other group. And when that gun was stuck in my head, that guy put his hand on the arm of the person putting the gun in my face and calmed him down. I don't know, I probably wouldn't be here today if he hadn't done that. So now that guy steps back a few paces, the gun's still pointed at me, and this man that was trying to help break up the fight had calmed him. Now, he did another thing, too. Every time that the other gentleman came and punched me in the face, this guy made a big show of it. "Ooh, you really hit him hard. That should be good." I don't know how many times that guy would have hit me or what they would have done after it, but this guy stopped them from going further. He protected me. How am I supposed to judge that group? Collectively? Or should I judge him or judge him by the content of his character? Now, if the police had shown up, he might have got arrested. I wouldn't have wanted to see that man go to jail. He stood up for me. I doubt he started that night wanting to be in that situation. Judging the content of one's character is a tough thing to do. I have a third story. Many of you know I have an adopted son. My family's up in
The speaker will just remind the gentleman, you have about a minute left.
I have an adopted son, Joseph. He's African American. About 7 months ago, I got a chance to watch him stand up for his little brother. And I guess I don't have time to give the rest of my speech on it, but it was really touching to me to watch race not be a part of one young man standing up for another young man against friends that he had already had. He'd already accrued, and it really touched me, and maybe I'm doing a good job as a father for my kids. Mr. Speaker, I guess what I would end with is I would say this. Each one of us here has our own squabbles. We have our own groups that we come to this with. We have people that surround us every day, and we have an opportunity every time we do that. While we might get mad at each other, and I've made you people mad, some of you on the other side, I forced you to actually have to gavel me a few times. But I know this, we have an opportunity every day, and we have a duty as legislators to try to look beyond the politics, look beyond all of the squabbles that we have, the affiliations that we have, and judge each and every one of us by the content of our character. And if we do, we will have earned our seat at the table of brotherhood that Reverend King talked about. And Mr. Speaker, I'm looking at you right now, and I'll tell you, in spite of all the squabbles, I hope you know something. I love you, and I love every member of this body. Regardless of the squabbles, I hope you know that if something were to happen, if some danger were to present itself, I would stand in front of you to protect you. Because I know the content of your character. And I appreciate it, and I appreciate every member of this body, and I thank you for the opportunity to rise and share those testimonies with you today. Thank you.
The Question before the House, the adoption of House Resolution 4647. As many as are in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The resolution is adopted. For what purpose does the lady from the 37th District rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise for a point of personal privilege. I make the motion that the remarks of the preceding speakers be spread upon the journal.
There's a motion to spread the remarks of the previous speakers among the journals. As many as in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. It is adopted. The gentleman from the 37th District, Representative Pettigrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There will be a Democratic caucus immediately.
Gentleman from the 17th District, Representative Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Republicans will caucus.
The House will be at ease for caucus. The House will be in order. Third order of business, message from the Senate. The clerk will read.
Madam Speaker, the Senate has passed
Last
second
line.
row second substitute Senate Bill number 5740.
Message received. Further message?
Madam Speaker, the Senate has passed engrossed Senate Bill number 5165.
Last line.
Sarah Bannister, Deputy Secretary.
Message received. Fourth order of business, with the consent of the House, the bills, memorials, and resolutions printed on today's introduction sheet will be considered first reading under the fourth order of business and will be referred to the committee so designated, except House Bill 2716 is referred to State Government and Tribal Relations, and House Bill 2573 is referred to Appropriations. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Fifth order of business, committee reports. With the consent of the House, the bills listed on today's committee reports under the fifth order of business will be referred to the committee so designated. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Sixth order of business, second reading of bills. The following bills: House Bill 1783 and correction, House Bill 1422 and 1783. House Bill 1422. Clerk will read.
An act relating
Last
to the
line.
protection, guardian of the decedent at the time of death.
With the consent of the House, the bill will be substituted as recommended by the Civil Rights and Judiciary Committee. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Amendment number 990. Clerk will read.
Strike everything after the enacting clause and insert
Last
the following.
line.
Correct the title.
Gentleman from the 46th District, Representative Valdez.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move striking Amendment 990.
It has been moved and seconded that Amendment 990 be adopted. Representative Valdez.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're just doing a few things in the striker, just cleaning up some language, changing a definition that needed to be changed, but more importantly, just changing the dates from 2020 to 2021. So I urge your adoption.
Further remarks? Gentleman from the 31st District, Representative Irwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have no objection to the amendment.
Question for the House, the adoption of Amendment 990. The gentleman from the 16th District, Representative Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please excuse Representative Griffey.
The member is excused. Question for the House, the adoption of Amendment 990. As many as are in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The amendment is adopted. There are no further amendments. With consent of the House, the rules will be suspended and engrossed substitute House Bill 1422 will be advanced to third reading. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Engrossed substitute House Bill 1422 on third reading and final passage. Remarks, the gentleman from the 46th District, Representative Valdez.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we're here today at the request of DSHS, and they need a little help from us. So when they go out and investigate folks who are being accused of abuse of our most vulnerable individuals, those folks who need to ensure that we are doing our best to take care of them, they had been using a definition of willful abuse in their investigations. But in 2017, a Court of Appeal ruling actually ruled that their use of that language that they used internally was no longer valid. So what we're mainly trying to accomplish here is making sure that we will now be referencing our federal language to making sure that we are consistent with our federal language along with our state. But there's three key highlights which I do want to share about this legislation. The first is about sharing of its data. So we have found that, and DSH has found that, they could be doing a little bit a better job of working with our sister agencies when it comes to investigation of these abuse cases. So, and actually, so what we're trying to do is making sure that they're working more closely with law enforcement. So if there's a case that needs to be referred to law enforcement, that they're actually working together. So when an investigation of abuse is found valid, that they can now be working together and being able to take care of what needs to be taken care of. Second key point is actually on disclosure. So currently, when there's an investigation that is undertaken or being looked into, the agency actually is not allowed to even acknowledge that there's an investigation going on. So we're actually going to bring a little transparency here, that if there is an ongoing investigation, the public has a right to know and actually find out exactly what's going on. And last but not least, when someone is found to be in violation of abusing one of those most vulnerable adults, they're placed on a registry. And currently, they're placed on that registry forever. There's no method or no procedures in place for that individual to actually apply or petition to be removed from that registry. So what we're trying to do here is to help DSHS actually help them establish rules and criteria. So if someone who has been found to be having abused someone in the past, that after a 3-year waiting period, they can actually now petition and to actually have their name removed from that registry if they're proven to be able to do so. So that's it. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Further remarks? Gentleman from the 31st District, Representative Irwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We think this is a good bill, and as we continue to face an age wave here in the state of Washington, it's more and more important and more incumbent upon the legislature and both sides of the aisle to not only provide for our seniors, but to protect them as they're moving into different types of housing and different types of living situations. We think this bill strikes a good balance between holding people accountable, but giving them an opportunity for appeal. And we're also very excited about DSHS recognizing that they haven't done the world's greatest job of sharing this information with sister agencies. So if you are having a problem with an individual or a caregiver or a company, that information will be shared in near real time so that people can react to that and keep folks safe. We urge adoption.
Further remarks? Seeing none, the question before the House is final passage of engrossed substitute House Bill 1422. The Speaker is about to open the roll call machine. The Speaker has opened the roll call machine. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? The Speaker is about to lock the roll call machine. The Speaker has locked the roll call machine. The clerk will take the record, please.
Mr. Speaker, there are 97 yeas, 0 nay, 1 excused.
Having received the constitutional majority, engrossed substitute House Bill 1422 is declared passed. House Bill 1783. Clerk will read.
An act relating to creating effect July 1st, 2019.
With the consent of the House, the bill will be substituted as recommended by the Appropriations Committee. Here, no objection, so ordered. Amendment number 964. The clerk will read.
Strike everything
Last
after
line.
Correct the title.
The lady from the 29th District, Representative Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I moved to adopt the striker numbers 964.
It has been moved and seconded that Amendment 964 be adopted. Amendment to the amendment, Amendment number 1006. Clerk will read.
On page 2, line 3 of the striking. 49.60.400.
Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Move 1006.
It has been moved and seconded that Amendment 1006 be adopted. Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The will of the people. There is policy in the underlying striker and the underlying bill here that lines up very closely with public policy that the voters of Washington considered just 10 weeks ago and turned down. We believe that in order to honor the will of the people, we don't always have to follow that will blindly, but we must recognize it. We must recognize it as the guidance that all of us on this floor, in this House, and in this Capitol should respect and ultimately apply to the public policies that we pursue here. What this amendment does is it clarifies and simplifies and brings into alignment with the will of the people so recently expressed that will make the underlying bill better public policy, fairer to all Washingtonians, and compliant with the will of our voters. I'm asking for a yes vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further remarks? Lady from the 33rd District, Representative Gregerson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand with a no vote on this. I appreciate what the good gentleman in the 19th is talking about in regarding honoring the will of the voters. Unfortunately, this legislation actually is actually illegal. Right now, we, under law, we don't have any hiring preferences, so I would say no to this amendment.
Further remarks? Seeing none, the question for the House is the adoption of Amendment 1006. As many as are in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The amendment fails. Amendment 1008. Clerk will read.
On page 3,
Last
line
line.
2, reports 2.
Lady from the 6th District, Representative Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Please move adoption of the amendment.
I move 1008.
It has been moved and seconded that Amendment 1008 be adopted. Representative Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The subject of equity is something that affects all of us in this state, and when it comes to recognizing different opinions, different ideas, it's something that should rest with more than just the decision of one person. So the idea behind this amendment is that it requires the director of the Office of Equity be jointly selected by the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader of the Senate, and the minority leaders of the House and Senate. I'm urging a yes vote.
Further remarks? Lady from the 33rd District, Representative Gregerson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I appreciate the remarks of the good gentlelady in the 6th District, I stand respectfully asking for a no vote. This potentially could, by having this joint appointment, could create a tie vote, and there are no other directors currently at this time that are appointed in this way. I suggest a no vote.
Further remarks? Question for the House, the adoption of Amendment 1008. As many as are in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The amendment fails. Amendment 1009. Clerk will read.
On page 3, line 7 of the striking amendment.
Last line.
Positions may not exceed 6.
Gentleman from the 15th District, Representative Defoe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move Amendment 1009.
It has been moved and seconded that Amendment 1009 be adopted. Representative Defoe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to advance this amendment to this particular striker. The current bill, as it's the underlying bill, requires or limits the Office of Equity to 6 full-time employees. What this amendment would do, Mr. Speaker, is it would make sure that that number is not exceeded in the future. It's very important, and I speak today on behalf of a constituent from my district, Ms. Carrie Hannon, who took the time to come out to our Office of Equity Task Force meeting in Yakima. We held hands around the circle with folks from all across the state, all walks of life, reflective of what the underlying intent of this bill is. And Ms. Hannon expressed a very important concern, and that is she wants to make sure that when this Office of Equity stands up, because she does want to see it eventually stood up, that there is not a politically correct police department inside of this office. And by limiting the number of FTEs, we can accomplish that, because under the version that the task force would like to see, Mr. Speaker, there are 26 full-time employees, including 4 with enforcement authority. And that 4 enforcement authority is duplicative of what already happens in the Human Rights Commission and in other organizations. So on behalf of Carrie Hannon from the 15th District, Mr. Speaker, I ask you to limit this to the 6 FTEs that are currently in the striker and not allow this to expand into another animal that is not what this body intends to move forward today.
Further remarks? Lady from the 33rd District, Representative Gregerson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand up respectfully asking for a no vote. I really appreciated the good representative from the 15th District in sharing so many hours of deliberation on this work, and I want to make sure that we honor the voices that definitely asked to not hinder the work when standing up the Office of Equity, and by limiting it to 6, that would definitely do that. I stand up here saying no to this amendment.
Further remarks? Seeing none, the question for the House, the adoption of Amendment 1009. As many as are in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. The amendment fails. Amendment 1007, clerk will read.
On page 4, beginning on line 20 of the
Last
striking
line.
amendment, all of subsection II.
Gentleman from the 26th District, Representative Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move Amendment 1007.
It has been moved and seconded that Amendment 1007 be adopted. Representative Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think there's a fundamental problem if the genesis of this bill, in fact, the title of the bill speaks to equity, if in fact there is a major group of race or ethnic minorities that feel as though it only increases disequity, increases their disenfranchisement, and that's what this amendment seeks to fix. The fact is the bill as it currently sits without this amendment seeks to predefine the type of reporting that will come out of the committee, and there are great communities right now speaking up that are telling us they feel that if the data is prescribed before it's produced and reported on, is already prescribed, it disenfranchises them even more. I think we should be listening to these minority groups. I think that we should hear them. This amendment does. It says that we are not going to prescribe it. We could offer this amendment, and if you took this amendment, it doesn't prescribe it. It gives us the flexibility to report it anyway. And that's what we should do. We should be providing for all sorts of reporting on this, give the office greater latitude so that we in fact do support and promote equity. So I encourage this amendment to the body. Thank you.
For the lady from the 33rd District, Representative Gregerson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand rising with a no vote for this amendment. I appreciate what the good gentleman in 26 is saying in regards to making sure that this office is able to use the data, use it appropriately to identify the disparities and work through the lens of equity. Unfortunately, this amendment doesn't go far enough, so I stand here with requesting for the no vote.
Further remarks? Gentleman from the 26th District, Representative Young.
I would just offer that our side is willing to pull the bill down and readjust the amendment to make it go far enough so that we can guarantee that this bill actually is equitable to every ethnic and racial minority. Thank you.
Further remarks? Question for the House, the adoption of Amendment 1007. As many as are in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. The amendment fails. Amendment 1010, clerk will read.
On page 4, line
Last
37, populations.
The lady from the 10th District, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move Amendment 1010.
It has been moved and seconded that Amendment 1010 be adopted. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Most people on this floor know that I have been doing a great deal of privacy work regarding our data privacy and protecting the constituents that we represent for a number of years here in this legislature. And I bring this amendment before you because of a concern I have. We can't even determine now, Mr. Speaker, how much information that could be potentially mined by those who would intend to harm us, or potentially subject to disclosure under any number of circumstances that are held by our state agencies now. What we do know is that we have a number of breaches that we have seen happen that have caused significant damage in the time that I've been here. Even in the last 5 or 6 years, we think of WSU, we think of our courts, we think of others. So my concern in the subject matter, no matter what the subject matter is, my concern is that as we collect data as a state, as we know with certainty that we become a target for cyber security attack across the world, and that those honeypots, the more information you put in a single source, it's called a honeypot, the more valuable that honeypot becomes to those who would harm us. And one of the great concerns I have is that I've been looking at how do we even know what we already have publicly identifiable? By our agencies, they can't even tell us with certainty. That's what I know. We can't even get a good assessment of that. That's what our brand new Chief Privacy Officer is trying to work on. So this limits, and we can look at a later point in time in which perhaps there is more data that we should be collecting, but this amendment says this new Office of Equity needs to be working with the Office of Privacy and Data Protection, needs to be working to ensure that we are minimizing the collection of data, that we are only collecting very specifically, if I may read from this, respond that no personally identifiable information could be even collected other than race and ethnicity, that it's identified in the bill. We don't need to be collecting more personally identifiably information until we are certain that we have locked down the protection for our constituents. Currently, that is not the case. I do not think we can say that. I don't think there's an agency that will not acknowledge that they have been working on this to improve it, but we're not locked down. Our information continues to be vulnerable. And so with that, I offer you this amendment. We can come back and look at it another day if we need to, but until we provide the kind of assurance that the most sensitive information cannot be matched to other information about individuals and cause harm ultimately, we need to be extraordinarily careful. With that, I would encourage a yes vote.
For the remarks, the lady from the 33rd District, Representative Gregerson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand rising in support of the amendment and appreciate the good gentlelady from the 10th.
Further remarks? Seeing none, the question for the House, the adoption of Amendment 1010. As many as are in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Amendment 1002, the clerk will read.
On page 7,
Last
line
line.
13, 2020, and insert 2021.
Gentleman from the 15th District, Representative Dufault.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move adoption of Amendment 1002.
It has been moved and seconded that Amendment 1002 be adopted. Representative Dufault.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of a transparent and accountable government. The Office of Equity Task Force convened last year under budget authorization from this body to come together and to study whether or not we should have an Office of Equity in the state of Washington and what that should look like and what its functions would be. The task force, of which I was proud to be a member, was very vigilant in their job. I want to give special acknowledgement to the good lady from the 33rd and the good lady from the 29th, who not only brought that opportunity to me and to this state, but also were traveling across the state at times even when I could not be there and gathering and understanding what was going on. There was one particular meeting, Mr. Speaker, in my district in Yakima, and one concern that I heard from people, in addition to the political correct police accountability issue, was that they wanted to make sure that their voice was heard. And there were a lot of opportunities for people to share their comments with me, but there weren't a lot of opportunities for them to share their comments with this body. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the report that we were tasked to complete is not even done yet, and it won't be done until July of 2020. So I think we're a little premature, Mr. Speaker, in setting this office into place before this body has even had an opportunity to read the report. And I think what we'll find when we read the report is that there are ways that we can improve this Office of Equity so that it really does what it says it's going to do and what we all want it to do, and that is to lift people up, not take anybody down. Yesterday in the Seattle Times, Mr. Speaker, Danny Westneat talked about the Chief of Equity at the Seattle Public Schools expressing some concern that there's a movement. There are some who would like to bring people down instead of lifting everybody up. And Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure that we are lifting everybody up and we are ensuring equitable treatment of all people in this state. So Mr. Speaker, I urge adoption of this amendment so that we can make sure that this body has time to consider all the facets of a new government office, a new government agency, before we proceed, set it up, and unleash it on the people of Washington State.
The lady from the 33rd District, Representative Gregerson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise with a no vote on this amendment. I appreciate the good gentleman from the 15th in attending every single one of the task force meetings, whether it was he or his staff or later on. And I agree that we heard over and over again that standing up this office was something very, very important to all Washingtonians. This money has been budgeted in the governor's office. This is something that we've been waiting for a very long time. So to put this off for another year would not work on behalf of the collaboration and all the work that's been done. So I urge a no vote.
Further remarks? Seeing none, the question for the House, the adoption of Amendment 1002. As many as are in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The amendment fails. Amendment 1003. The clerk will read.
On page 7, after line 13 of the striking amendment, insert the following. New section, section 13, this act expires June 30th, 2031.
Gentleman from the 12th District, Representative Gaynor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this amendment.
Please move adoption of the amendment.
I'm sorry. I move adoption of Amendment 1003.
It has been moved and seconded that Amendment 1003 be adopted. Representative Gaynor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this amendment because of the accountability aspect of it. We've talked about transparency and accountability, and we also need to talk about effectiveness. By sunsetting this act, it actually keeps the burden of responsibility with this body who is creating this office. And I have seen many times where agencies have been created and things have been put in place with no real accountability about how effective they've been. By sunsetting this bill, this office, it would actually require them to come back with a report to the legislature. If they're being effective, then there may not be a need for this office. And if not, we'll actually know what kinds of tweaks to make to it. But I would encourage support of this amendment. Thank you.
The lady from the 33rd District, Representative Gregerson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise with a no vote on this amendment. I appreciate the good gentleman from the 12th. Oftentimes, there are times where we clean up things and we continue to work on making sure that government is efficient. In this case, it's taken us hundreds of years to get to this place today. I would urge a no vote.
Further remarks? Gentleman from the 20th District, Representative DeBolt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I see this as a hopeful amendment. I see this amendment as an opportunity to say that we actually can accomplish our jobs and that this office will someday reach its goal and that people will be treated equally, and it doesn't need to exist forever because we will get the job done. So I see this as a hopeful amendment. I wouldn't want to see this as something that we think just has to stay in perpetuity because that means that we will never see equality for all people. And so this amendment to me represents the hope that we can actually change our state, make our state a better place, and not need this in the future. Thank you.
Further remarks? The lady from the 36th District, Representative Tarleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to stand again and ask for a no vote. The points are well taken by the gentleman from the other side, but I will remind the body that we have in place a system to do audits of state agencies, and to have reports to the legislature about the performance of our state agencies. So there is a certainty that this office, of course, will be subjected to future performance audits, and legislatures at that time will have the opportunity to evaluate the continued performance and certainly the critical need to establish this office now. I ask for a no vote.
Further remarks? Seeing none, the question for the House is the adoption of Amendment 1003. As many as are in favor say aye. Opposed, no? No! The amendment fails. Now the question for the House is the striking amendment as amended. As many as are in favor say aye. Aye! Opposed, no? The amendment is adopted. There are no further amendments. With the consent of the House, the rules will be suspended, and engross second substitute House Bill 1783 will be advanced to third reading. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Engross second substitute House Bill 1783 on third reading and final passage. Remarks. The lady from the 33rd District, Representative Gregerson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for hearing this very important bill. It was in 2008 when I was a new elected, and it was the first time that I had read a health impact report. And this was published by the Department of Health. And at that time, it talked about the built environment, jobs, education, access to variable transportation choices, and through that became predictable outcomes. Those predictable outcomes through equations all of a sudden made me realize that the life expectancy in the zip code that I live, in the city that I live in, I was assumed to live 10 years less than those in the same county as mine. So you can imagine, as a newly elected official, this became a very big deal for me, and I needed to understand what that meant. So fast forward that 10 years later, and in 2018, the Governor's Interagency of Council of Health Disparities had just finished a 2-year report. And in that report, they have a quote. May I read, Mr. Speaker?
Please continue.
Thank you. Currently, there are state agency programs implementing best practices, and others are testing new strategies to promote equity. However, this work is fragmented and inconsistent across state government. The Council believes that a comprehensive, enterprise-wide approach to intentionally consider equity in government policies, programs, and decisions is needed for enduring change to actually occur. So I want to recognize and applaud a lot of the different things that have been happening in state agencies, such as the work of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. They're doing great things, but a lot of that is actually inward-facing. The state is prepared and ready to take the next step towards equity in state government. The state needs to have strong leadership. That means that the director must be at the cabinet level and advising the governor. That means that we need to codify this for permanency. This is a promise to all the agencies that doing this work and the constituents that we serve. And the resources. We fund our values. For example, if we have communities in Eastern Washington and they need us, we need to come up with an action plan, and we need to fund that and make that an issue. And data. We all know that data is one of the biggest topics of this time. And we need to ensure that what we do with it, we're doing it together, and that we know how to collect it, and then we track it, and of course, we disaggregate it the way that we need to in order to understand what's happening. But last but not least is accountability. We can't operate in a unified way if we don't have all of the agencies working together. And we certainly can't continue to have the trust of this office if the communities won't buy in. Today, we are ready to implement the next step, and that's to start the Office of Equity. And please remember that this will be the first one in the nation, but there are over 150 other local jurisdictions around the country that have been doing this for years. So we don't have to start from scratch. And in fact, we spent the last 2 years listening and learning, and there are many agencies, jurisdictions in the state actually that we can listen from. But I must thank all of the staff and the communities that volunteer time to offer their voices, to let us know what they want, what they dream of. This also meant that we traveled every corner of the state, as a good representative mentioned. But on that journey, we have asked for best practices and we've asked for bold ideas. What we also heard were the concerns of the past and the worries of the future. But in the end, There was an overwhelming response that this is the time, this is the place, and they want this office, and they want to be part of it. And I know change is hard, and that today's vote is just another step to that commitment of the great work that's happening around us. And let's not forget that the agencies are doing great work. The larger ones are doing great, and the smaller ones are resilient. That shift will happen when we open this office, and some will say it's too slow, and some will say it's too fast. But regardless, the work must be done. We must be doing it together, and this is a great start. Mr. Speaker, I hope you'll stand with me and support this bill. Thank you.
Further remarks? The gentleman from the 15th District, Representative Defoe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd just like to again echo my comment on the good lady from the 33rd. She has put her heart and soul into this, and I share her interest in bringing about equitable treatment to all people in Washington State. I'd also like to briefly acknowledge the two task force chairs, Jan Olmstead and Dr. Benjamin Danielson. Their passion for this issue and for this effort was quite inspirational, along with all the other members. Mr. Speaker, I'm so proud to be a part of a legislative body that has equity at the forefront of its mind. I believe most, if not all, members of this body are focused on ensuring equitable treatment for all people in Washington, every single one of their constituents. And Mr. Speaker, I'm so proud to be a part of a body that has a woman Speaker of the House, and what that means for our state and what it means for so many young people around our state. I'm also pleased, Mr. Speaker, that in 2019 we had the first African-American Speaker of the Washington State House of Representatives. And I hope you will indulge me a point of personal privilege in the middle of my speech to say, congratulations for being the first African-American Speaker of the Washington State House of Representatives. You are an inspiration to many, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in opposition at this time to an office of equity, however, Mr. Speaker. And the reason for that is indicated in my speeches on the amendments. We have to be accountable. We have to be transparent with the people of Washington. And this process, while it's a good start, we're not there yet. I'll give you an example, Mr. Speaker. A survey went out across the state. The responses to that survey numbered in the hundreds. Out of a state of millions of people, there were around 200 responses asking people what they thought about an Office of Equity and what they thought it should look like. Of those survey responses, Mr. Speaker, 86% came from Puget Sound. Only 2% came from Central Washington. My district, Mr. Speaker, in Central Washington is a majority-minority district, primarily Latino. We have Native American, African American, Filipino American. They are some of the folks who I would like to see benefit from an eventual Office of Equity, but their voices were not heard in this process, Mr. Speaker. Please, I ask this body to give them an opportunity to shape this important institution for our state and not rush to create something that isn't ready. Mr. Speaker, we have other offices around this state, the Human Rights Commission, a number of other commissions whose job is to advance equity in our state. One of their jobs is to advance equity in our state. Mr. Speaker, we have to be able to go home to our taxpayers, to our constituents, and say, we are being good stewards of your money. Yes, equity is important, but not at the expense of everything else. Mr. Speaker, with the budget that this Office of Equity will soon have, because the task force wants 26 full-time employees and they want a $5 million budget, and with the failure of the earlier amendment, I think we're on that track, Mr. Speaker, and we all know that. We are going to be spending money on setting up a government office that could be used to directly attack the problems that exist in my district and exist in districts around this state, Mr. Speaker, to bring about equity. Mr. Speaker, there are so many streets on so many roads in my district that are gravel. And do you know who lives on those gravel streets, Mr. Speaker? Native Americans, Latinos. They live along those streets. And they breathe in the dust, and this came up in my community forum, Mr. Speaker. They breathe in the dust on their way to school, and they have higher incidence of asthma in the state. Mr. Speaker, if I could just have 10% of that $5 million on 1 year, we could pave all the streets in Parker, Washington with matching funds in my district, Mr. Speaker. Let's put the money at the source. Let's solve the problem. We, the Washington State Legislature, we should be the Office of Equity, and I ask that we act on that mandate today, and we move forward, keep the discussion going, but not open this office in its current form today. And Mr. Speaker, I conclude with a remark from Dr. Martin Luther King, who said that he became so enamored with the insights of liberalism that he almost fell into the trap of accepting uncritically everything it accomplished. We have to keep focused on serving the people, serving the people, serving the people, not serving government agencies. Mr. Speaker, I ask a no vote.
Further remarks. The lady from the 29th District, Representative Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the good lady from the 33rd for her tireless work on this important piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, I represent a district with great parity that has highly diverse population, but yet we have twice the average rate of preventable hospitalizations. And why is that? Because we are considered to be in the red zone. And what does that mean? We have low birth weights. We have high blood pressure, we have heart disease. We actually die 8 years earlier than 10 minutes across I-5. What does this do to the residents' health in my district? The other issue is the 29th has one of the lowest rate of voter participation. These facts alone speak to the need for a state equity office to examine what is happening systematically that is causing so many disparities. Mr. Speaker, Washington State needs to have a coordinated plan to address systematic inequities. As a former school board director, Mr. Speaker, I did not realize the exact devastation that plagues my community until I started digging into the data and noticed the disparities. My experience with the National School Board Association and the Washington State School Board Director Association showed me that this office is extremely important to address the inequities being felt by all the struggling families in our state. Mr. Speaker, I was appointed during the interim to be on that very task force that the good gentleman from the 15th speaks of. And what I know and what I experienced on that task force was great minds coming together, from the commissions to the governor's office to public comments. And they all wanted the same thing, is to have an office that has accountability and measurable components to it. And I believe that that task force did their job. They came up with great accountability and measurements. Of course, I was on that subgroup. But Mr. Speaker, this is an important piece of legislation that I think that all legislators need to continue to be equitable and the nation's leader. Mr. Speaker, may I read a quote from the famous Dr. Martin Luther King?
Please continue.
We must come to see that the end we seek in a society of peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. Mr. Speaker, I urge a yes vote on this very, very important piece of legislation. Thank you.
Further remarks? The lady from the 10th District, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to acknowledge the remarks that have already been spoken in favor of this bill. I want to particularly acknowledge the good woman from the 33rd District who has put her heart into this legislation. I know what that feels like. I know the hard work that it takes to bring that kind of passion to something, and I am grateful for that. I also want to acknowledge the good woman from the 37th District, who has been doing this since I arrived here 13 years ago, in addressing issues of equity and marginalized communities and people who have no voice here. I want you to know, Mr. Speaker, and my colleagues to know, particularly these women, that they have influenced my thinking, that they have caused me to take stands that are hard to take because I believe it's the right thing to do. And it's because of this. This place is where we give voice to those who have no voice. So it is with difficulty that I rise today in opposition to this bill at this time. It's in part because of the work we have done, looking at what's already on the books and why they have not been effective. Why is it? These are the questions we need to ask, Mr. Speaker. Why is it? And if I may read this list, Mr. Speaker,
Please continue.
why is it that if we have a commission on African American affairs, a commission on Asian Pacific American affairs, a commission on Hispanic affairs, a governor's office on Indian affairs, a human rights commission, an LGBTQ commission, a women's commission, and in addition, the Office of Minority and Veterans-Owned Businesses, and I forget the total name because we've added some words in there. We've been working in that space to try to reform and fix what happened in our yesterdays. There's been so much good work there under the leadership of the woman from the 37th District. The larger question here, Mr. Speaker, is why is what we are doing not working? That's the question. We all agree that we have communities who have no voice. And Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to you that this session, we're going to be looking at other pieces of legislation in which million-dollar rooms of lobbyists will have an extraordinary say, and those same communities will have very little say. This is about the work we do and whether or not we can do it in a way that gives rise to the voices who are voiceless here. My no vote today is not about the issue. It's about the failure of government to act on what we know to be true. And if we have to take this step, it's because other steps that we have taken are in and of themselves impotent to change the situation. So rather than taking another step to layer over that, let's take a step back. Let's say together, we're going to figure out a way to give marginalized communities no voice. We're going to figure out a way to take on the monetary interest here that dominate often these discussions. We're going to say that we're going to work together, both chambers, and we're going to come up with something that is meaningful, that will move the dial, and that will give people voice. With that, I would encourage a no vote today and a yes vote to something unifying that will make a difference. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further remarks? The gentleman from the 8th District, Representative Clippert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tried to sit here and say nothing, but could no longer. July 4th, 1776. 56 men gathered and they agreed on a document that they all would sign. And the first line of that document was so important that they put it at the very first. And in that first line they said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men," and I believe in my heart they implied women too, "all men and all women, all are created equal." They did that because there was a domineering government that decided some people are more equal than others. And they gathered together at the risk of their own peril to say, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Mr. Speaker, last year we heard a bill like this in the Judiciary Committee. Many people spoke. A man with skin much darker than my own spoke in opposition to that bill that day. And I saw a recorded message from him afterwards where he said, "Equality, yes. Equity, no." Why? Because that empowers government to make a decision on maybe a school, maybe it's a job, that some people in some situations based on a numbers game are more equal than others. And I'm here today to agree with our founding fathers that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, despite the color of their skin, all women, despite their ethnic origin, are created equal and have an equal opportunity to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Equality, yes. Equity, no. For that, I'll be speaking and voting no, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Further remarks? The lady from the 28th District, Representative Kilduff.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And standing today to offer some closing words from our side and standing in strong support of House Bill 1783. And I stand before you as the granddaughter of 4 Irish immigrants, the mother of 2 Chinese-American immigrants who we adopted from China, Amelia and Julia, actually our youngest, 17 years ago. Yesterday was delivered to our arms. And also as a member of the LGBTQ community, having been the beneficiary of the acts of this chamber through marriage equality, having met my wife now 30 years ago this year. And I stand as well with great excitement about this proposal around its nuts and the bolts of it, the policies and systems that we will be taking a harder, longer, stronger look at. But perhaps most exciting about this legislation is its vision, the vision for fairness, the vision, yes, for equality, but also a vision for equity. What can we do, according to this vision, to improve the lives of Washingtonians across our state? How can we do what we do better and apply an equity lens to our work? And let's also ask the question, who is not at the table? What voices are not being heard? And this bill gets more voices into the discussion around the work that we do across our state. That makes our government all the more accountable to the people that we serve. Mr. Speaker, I've stood before on this floor and said this, that we are one Washington, and we are one Washington of many diverse communities. In other words, somos un solo Washington compuesto de muchas comunidades diversas. So I ask you, Mr. Speaker, for one Washington and the many diverse communities that we represent, that you vote yes. Yes for fairness, yes for equality, and yes to advance equity across our state.
Further remarks? Member from the 19th District, Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How do you hold a bureaucracy accountable when you haven't even defined its fundamental purpose yet? Now, one of the problems that we have with this bill, and one of the reasons to vote no for it, is the task force report, which will define, for the purposes of this new bureaucracy, the term equity hasn't been delivered yet. So we're not really sure what this term means, what terms like fairness, what terms like equality, for the purposes of this agency, even mean. You know, we can talk about vision, but how do you define vision when you don't know what your first principles are? This bill is dashing in a haphazard way to conclusions that we have no idea what they'll entail. It's an agency focused, frankly, on other agencies. You know, Mr. Speaker, in my district, there's a small family-run Mexican restaurant that, for my money, makes the best tacos this side of Guadalajara. And, you know, they've struggled to put their restaurant together. They struggle to keep the place staffed. They struggle to do all the things that small businesses in this state struggle to do. And if you went in and told the owner, who's working over the grill a lot of the time, that we've come up with a way to help his family do better in this state, and that the way is a new governor's agency, he would wipe his sweaty brow and laugh a rueful laugh and tell you he'd much rather have a tax break than a new bureaucracy. We have to ask ourselves questions, Mr. Speaker. Why, after 30 years of one-party rule in this state, do we need so desperately a new bureaucracy to measure the performance of existing bureaucracy? If the existing offices and commissions that have been working for decades to improve people's lot in the state aren't effective, why should we create more agency to oversee them? That's only mapping non-productive activity. And if those other commissions and agencies are effective, why do we need this new bureaucracy to measure them? Look, I don't doubt that the intent behind this bill and this new agency is well-meaning and well-intended. But does this new bureaucracy deliver to the owners of that Mexican restaurant any appreciable good? Well, Mr. Speaker, we can't even answer that question because we don't know what the mission of this bureaucracy is yet. We've made a number of well-intended proposed amendments here that would make this new bureaucracy more accountable, more transparent, and more effective for the people of Washington. If those amendments had been accepted, we might have been to a place where we could support this new office. But they weren't. And so for now, for the sake of accountability, for the sake of transparency, and for the sake of the best interests of individuals and small businesses all around our state, I'm asking for a no vote on this bill. Thank you.
Further remarks? Seeing none, the question for the House is final passage of Reverend Grove's second substitute House Bill 1783. The Speaker is about to open the roll call machine. The Speaker has opened the roll call machine. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? Speaker is about to lock the roll call machine. The Speaker has locked the roll call machine. The clerk will take the record, please.
Mr. Speaker, there are 56 yeas, 41 nays, 1 excused.
Having received the constitutional majority in Grove's second substitute House Bill 1783 is declared passed. Eighth order of business. With the consent of the House, House Bill 2573 is re-referred from Appropriations to Human Services and Early Learning, and House Bill 2256 is re-referred from College and Workforce Development to Finance. Hearing no objection, so ordered. With the consent of the House, we will now adjourn until 9:55 a.m. Tuesday, January 21st, the 9th legislative day. Hearing no objection, so ordered. The House is now adjourned until 9:55 a.m. Tuesday, January 21st.